The dining room at Copacabana nightclub was nearly empty. The music had stopped hours earlier. Chairs were stacked, glasses unwashed. Only one table remained occupied. A man sat there alone beneath the dim amber lights, suit pressed, hair combed perfectly, waiting. Outside, a Cadillac idled near the curb. Inside the kitchen corridor, two men moved quietly past the steel counters. No shouting, no threats, no hesitation. One carried a .38 revolver wrapped in a white towel. They entered the dining room. 3 shots. The man never reached the door. When police arrived, they found the body of Carmine Galante slumped in his chair, a cigar still burning between his fingers. At first glance, it looked like another mafia execution. But investigators would slowly realize something unsettling. This killing had not been ordered by the mafia's ruling council, not by the commission. Instead, the decision had been quietly negotiated in a far more unexpected place. Not in a courtroom, not in a secret meeting of bosses, but inside a nightclub, a place where gangsters drank, politicians socialized, and power quietly changed hands. The Copacabana.to understand why a nightclub could decide the fate of a mafia boss. You have to understand the man who forced that decision. Carmine Galante was not built for diplomacy. He was built for war. Born in New York City in 1910 to Sicilian immigrants, Galante grew up inside the narrow streets of East Harlem, a neighborhood where law came from 2 places, the church and the mafia. By his teenage years, Galante was already known to police. Armed robbery, assault, street rackets. Violence came naturally to him, and unlike many future bosses, he never tried to hide it. Prison became part of his routine, but prison also became his classroom. Inside the federal system, Galante formed connections with men tied to one of New York's most powerful criminal organizations, the Bonanno crime family. At the top of that family stood a quiet strategist, Joseph Bonanno. Bonanno believed in discipline, structure, patience. He also believed in loyalty. Galante possessed one of those qualities in absolute form, loyalty. By the 1940s, Galante had become one of Bonanno's most feared enforcers. Not a diplomat, not a politician, an executioner. His reputation spread quickly through the underworld of New York City. When disputes required intimidation, Galante appeared. When intimidation failed, the outcome usually involved a body. But organized crime in America was not just violence. It was governance. After years of bloody internal wars during the early 20th century, mafia leaders created a national ruling council known as the American Mafia Commission. Its purpose was simple: prevent chaos. The commission functioned like a board of directors for organized crime. Representatives from powerful families, including the Genovese crime family, the Gambino crime family, and the Bonanno crime family, met privately to resolve disputes and authorize major decisions. Assassinations of bosses required approval. Territory disputes required negotiation. Power was supposed to be managed carefully, but the commission had a weakness. It depended on cooperation, and cooperation required restraint. Restraint was something Carmine Galante never learned. By the 1950s, his ambitions were growing faster than the system designed to contain them. Meanwhile, another force was quietly shaping the underworld: social spaces, places where gangsters, celebrities, and politicians could meet without the formality of mafia councils. One of the most important was the Copacabana nightclub. Inside its dining rooms, deals were discussed casually over drinks. Alliances formed between men who would never appear together in a commission meeting. Official power sat in secret conferences. Real influence often moved somewhere else, behind the velvet curtains of a nightclub. And as Carmine Galante's ambitions expanded, those quiet conversations began turning against him. By the early 1950s, Carmine Galante had become one of the most feared men in the American underworld, not because he held the highest rank, but because he operated without hesitation. Inside the Bonanno crime family, power still belonged to Joseph Bonanno. Bonanno ruled differently from many mafia leaders of his era. He preferred long-term strategy over street violence. He studied politics, alliances, and the fragile balance between the five families. Galante represented the opposite philosophy. Where Bonanno used patience, Galante used fear. Yet Bonanno kept him close. Every criminal empire requires a man willing to do the things others will not. Galante became that man. By the mid-1950s, he controlled powerful rackets across New York City, loan sharking, gambling operations, and labor infiltration. But his true influence came from something far more dangerous: heroin. International narcotics trafficking was becoming the most profitable business in organized crime. Traditional mafia bosses had long avoided open involvement. Drugs attracted federal attention. They destabilized families. But Galante saw something different: opportunity. Working through Sicilian connections, he helped expand heroin pipelines linking Sicily, Marseille, and New York City. The network would later become associated with what investigators called the pizza connection, a system that used pizzerias as distribution fronts across the United States. The profits were enormous. Millions of dollars began moving quietly through Galante's circle. But profits also create suspicion. Other mafia leaders began noticing something troubling. Galante was no longer behaving like an underboss. He was behaving like a future king. Then, in 1957, organized crime faced a crisis that changed everything. Police raided a secret gathering of mafia bosses in Apalachin, New York during the infamous Apalachin meeting. Dozens of powerful figures fled into the woods as state troopers closed in. For the first time, the American public saw clear evidence of a national mafia structure. Federal pressure exploded. Congress held hearings. Prosecutors began building organized crime task forces. The era of quiet operations was ending. And in that new environment, Carmine Galante became a liability. His reputation for violence, his open pursuit of narcotics profits, his growing independence from the commission, all of it threatened the delicate balance that kept the mafia functioning. Yet Galante showed no concern. If anything, the pressure seemed to strengthen his ambition. He began imagining something few mobsters dared to attempt: total control of the Bonanno crime family, and eventually, influence over all five families. The system created to prevent mafia wars was about to face a man who believed he was above it. The first real crack in the system appeared in the early 1960s. At the center of it stood Joseph Bonanno. For decades, Bonanno had ruled the Bonanno crime family with quiet authority. But power inside the American Mafia was never permanent. It depended on balance with the other families and the approval of the American Mafia Commission. In 1964, that balance collapsed. Bonanno became entangled in a secret plan, later known as the Bonanno War, an attempted power grab against rival bosses in New York City. The scheme failed. Instead of consolidating power, Bonanno disappeared. For nearly 2 years, he was absent from public view. Some believed he had been kidnapped. Others suspected he had fled to avoid retaliation. Inside the mafia, absence created a vacuum. Rival factions within the Bonanno family began fighting for control. Assassinations and attempted killings spread quietly through the underworld. What had once been one of the most disciplined crime families became unstable. Federal investigators watched carefully. The mafia's internal war confirmed something authorities had long suspected. The organization was vulnerable when leadership fractured. Meanwhile, one of Bonanno's most dangerous loyalists was sitting in prison. Carmine Galante had been convicted on narcotics charges in the early 1960s. His absence temporarily removed him from the family's internal struggle. But prison did not end his influence. From inside the federal system, Galante maintained contact with loyal captains. Messages traveled quietly between inmates and the streets. Plans continued forming beyond prison walls. When he was finally released in 1974, the landscape had changed. The Bonanno family was weakened. The American Mafia Commission had lost patience with internal conflict. And Carmine Galante returned to New York City with a reputation that had only grown darker during his absence. But something else had changed too. Galante no longer intended to serve anyone. He began behaving like the undisputed boss of the Bonanno crime family. He ignored the commission. He elevated loyalists into powerful positions. He openly expanded heroin operations across the United States. For older mafia leaders, the message was clear. Carmine Galante was not rebuilding the Bonanno family. He was transforming it into something far more dangerous: personal empire. And if that empire continued to grow, the balance that held the five families together might collapse completely. By the mid-1970s, the American Mafia faced an enemy it had never encountered before. Not a rival family, the federal government. Since the exposure of the Appalachian meeting, law enforcement had begun reorganizing its approach to organized crime. Prosecutors no longer focused on isolated murders or gambling rings. They were targeting the entire system. In 1970, Congress passed the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, commonly known as RICO. For the first time, prosecutors could charge mafia leaders not only for crimes they committed, but for crimes committed by the organizations they controlled. The law terrified the underworld, because the structure of Cosa Nostra depended on hierarchy. Orders flowed downward, profits flowed upward. Now the law worked the same way. Responsibility flowed upward. At the same time, federal investigators began building long-term intelligence operations. Wiretaps, surveillance teams, and informants slowly mapped the structure of the five families in New York City. For cautious mafia bosses, survival required discipline. Low visibility, quiet operations. But Carmine Galante followed none of those rules. Instead of hiding his power, he displayed it openly. Galante was frequently seen dining in public restaurants with armed bodyguards. He held loud meetings with his captains. Associates boasted about heroin profits moving through pizza parlors across the country. The narcotics trade was growing rapidly. So was federal attention. Within the American Mafia Commission, concern spread quietly. If Galante's drug empire collapsed under federal investigation, prosecutors might expose the entire mafia leadership. One reckless boss could bring down everyone. More troubling was Galante's attitude toward the commission itself. Traditionally, major decisions required collective approval. Galante ignored that structure. He promoted his own loyalists. He sidelined older captains. And he spoke openly about ruling the Bonanno crime family without interference. For other bosses, this was more than arrogance. It was a threat, because if one family abandoned the system, others might follow. The delicate balance that prevented mafia wars could collapse overnight. Quiet discussions began spreading among rival leaders. Not in official commission meetings. Those were too visible. Instead, conversations moved somewhere safer. Private tables, dim lights, places where powerful men could speak without attracting attention. Places like the Copacabana nightclub. And in those rooms, a dangerous question was beginning to form. If Carmine Galante refused to follow the rules, what was the only solution left? Power inside the mafia rarely collapses suddenly. It erodes, quietly, gradually, almost invisibly. By 1978, Carmine Galante still appeared untouchable. He traveled with armed guards. Loyal Sicilian bodyguards stood beside him at every meeting. His narcotics network was producing enormous profits. From the outside, the boss of the Bonanno crime family looked stronger than ever. But power in organized crime depends on something fragile: permission. Every mafia boss rules only as long as the other families tolerate him. The balance between the five families in New York City depended on mutual restraint. Galante had broken that restraint. Across the city, other leaders were watching closely. Among them were figures like Paul Castellano and Anthony Salerno. Neither man wanted a public conflict. A mafia war would invite federal intervention at the worst possible moment. Just as prosecutors were expanding their use of the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. But allowing Galante to continue unchecked carried its own danger. He was expanding heroin operations without consultation. He was promoting loyalists over experienced captains. Most troubling of all, he had begun ignoring the authority of the American Mafia Commission. Inside the Bonanno family itself, resentment was building. Several longtime captains understood what Galante refused to see. His ambition was placing everyone at risk. Federal investigators were already circling his narcotics network. If arrests began spreading upward, the entire leadership structure could collapse. At that point, survival demanded something unthinkable: internal betrayal. Discussions began moving through back channels across the New York underworld. Official meetings were avoided. Too many eyes, too many informants. Instead, conversations happened in familiar social spaces: restaurants, private clubs, nightclubs, places where powerful men could appear to be enjoying dinner while quietly negotiating the future of organized crime. One location became particularly useful: the Copacabana nightclub. For decades, it had hosted celebrities, politicians, businessmen, and gangsters under the same roof. This crowded dining room provided something invaluable: cover. Here, alliances formed discreetly. Messages passed quietly between families. No official records, no formal votes, only consensus. And during those quiet conversations, a final conclusion slowly emerged. If Carmine Galante could not be controlled, he would have to be removed. The only question remaining was how, and more importantly, who inside his own family would allow it to happen. The plan that ended Carmine Galante did not require a war. It required silence. By the summer of 1979, the decision had quietly solidified among leaders connected to the American Mafia Commission. Galante's expansion, his narcotics empire, and his refusal to respect mafia hierarchy had crossed the final line. But killing a boss carried risks. The only way to do it without triggering retaliation was simple: his own family had to allow it. Several captains inside the Bonanno crime family were already losing patience. Galante had surrounded himself with loyal Sicilian gunmen and excluded longtime members from power. Quietly, some of those captains withdrew their protection. It was the signal outsiders needed. On July 12, 1979, Galante arrived for lunch at Joe Mary's Italian-American restaurant, a modest neighborhood establishment in Brooklyn. Two of his Sicilian bodyguards sat beside him at the outdoor patio table. Cigars were lit. Wine was poured. To anyone passing by, it looked like a routine afternoon. But something was already wrong. The bodyguards who normally watched the entrance were gone. Moments later, 3 men entered the patio area carrying shotguns and handguns. Witnesses later described the attack as cold and methodical. No shouting, no hesitation. The gunmen opened fire. Dozens of rounds tore through the small patio. When the shooting stopped, Carmine Galante lay slumped in his chair. A cigar still rested between his fingers. His 2 bodyguards were dead beside him. The gunmen walked away calmly. They were never officially identified, but investigators quickly noticed something unusual. 2 of Galante's closest associates, men seated at the same table, had survived the attack completely unharmed. They had not fired back. They had not been targeted. Inside the mafia, the message was unmistakable. The execution had not been an act of revenge. It had been authorization, and the approval had come from the only authority that mattered: the mafia itself. The streets of New York City fell silent after Carmine Galante was killed. For the public, it was another headline: a violent mafia execution. A man gunned down in broad daylight. But for those inside the underworld, the implications ran far deeper. The Bonanno crime family was fractured yet stabilized. Galante's loyalists either fled, went underground, or quietly aligned with the commission-approved leadership. The American Mafia Commission reasserted its authority. They made no public statement, none was needed. Silence, and the careful restoration of order, was more powerful than words. Meanwhile, federal investigators were left with fragments. RICO laws would eventually begin dismantling networks, but Galante's assassination slowed their progress. Without a surviving boss to interrogate, the narcotics empire became harder to trace. The event also sent a message beyond New York. Across the United States, mafia bosses understood the invisible rules. Personal ambition must never exceed collective tolerance. The Copacabana, the restaurant patios, the private clubs, they were no longer just social venues. They were theaters of influence, where decisions about life, death, and power were quietly sanctioned. For the Bonanno family, order returned, but at a cost. A reminder lingered that leadership was fragile, loyalty conditional, and authority always negotiable. And for the Mafia, the system survived, but barely. One reckless man had exposed the limits of governance and reminded everyone that even the most powerful organizations could fracture under the weight of ambition. The murder of Carmine Galante did more than remove a dangerous figure. It revealed a fundamental truth about organized crime. Authority is less about formal structures and more about perception, consent, and the unspoken rules that govern human behavior. The American Mafia Commission could sanction or forbid, but real power moved elsewhere. Nightclubs, restaurants, private tables, spaces where ambition, fear, and loyalty collided, often decided the fates of men far more effectively than any official council. The Copacabana was more than a backdrop. It was a symbol of the invisible architecture of power. Galante's life and death demonstrate a circular truth. In a system built on violence, hierarchy, and secrecy, the greatest threat comes not from outside enforcement, but from within. The same ambition that fuels rise can invite destruction. The story ends where it began. A man alone at a table, lights dim, decisions already made. His empire of fear could not protect him. And yet, the system endured, quietly absorbing the shock, restoring balance, and reminding all who watch that power is not simply held. It is negotiated, constantly, in the shadows. The Copacabana survived, the Commission survived, and the lesson remains. Sometimes the true levers of control are not written in law books, but in smoke-filled rooms where the world believes only entertainment occurs, yet destiny is quietly determined.